So I'd like to welcome you to this panel on Ilanot. It's a very, very innovative project, and I was really eager, and I did my best to twist Yossi's arm to organize this panel because I think it's so innovative. It does a number, and we'll see that it will achieve a number of the objectives of the conference. I was very, very eager that we represent aspects of Jewish studies other than the modern period. And that means other than post war, Holocaust, 20th century, 19th century. And so I was very, very happy when we were able to achieve that with this panel. But the second is that it's dealing also with Jewish visual culture and dealing with it in a period before the modern period. Thirdly, it was dealing with a religious topic, which is not well represented at the conference. But I think above all, because it's a very, very innovative demonstration of the application of digital tools. We've had a lot of conversation about the role of digitization and new technologies in academia generally and Jewish studies specifically, but a lot of it has to do with simply digitizing sources and manipulating data. And that's just simply the beginning. But here we've got something that goes way, way beyond those first steps. And that's what I find so very, very innovative, that these are tools that are being applied to the analysis and interpretation of this really, really interesting material. So now I see that we have Moshe Idel with us. Moshe, thank you very, very much for chairing this panel. And with that, I'm going to turn the panel over to you. If you will unmute your mic, and I will give it to you to introduce the panel and to introduce Yossi, who will get us started. And I thank you very, very much, and I'm looking forward to the panel. And I'm going to now turn myself off. Okay, thank you. I'm going to turn myself off if I can figure out how to do it. I may have to ask.
That was the way. Moshe, just unmute. There's a little green button, כפתור ירוק בקו התחתון של החלון. Okay, maybe not that כפתור. One more. כפתור עם...
כרגע זה אדום, הכפתור שלו זה אדום כי הוא muted.
Right. כפתור אדום עם הסימן של מיקרופון.
Now,
there you go. Yeah, we hear you.
First. So it's my great pleasure and honor to introduce the panel. I must make a confession. Many years ago, I had the same idea, but fortunately, I didn't enter too much because maybe I understood that that's a project that no one can do it alone. So I desisted for many, many years to keep collecting the Ilanot and Eitzim and all the other devices. And happily, Professor Jeffrey Hayes and his team started to map the maps and create a project that started already to be published, and hopefully his book on the trees will be published. It's a lot of material. I can tell you, even years ago, without working too much, I've seen that impossible to map everything. And the questions I didn't ask then were asked meanwhile about what is the meaning of all the diagrams and designs and paratext, how you like to call it, for understanding Kabbalah. So we are now in a much better position after some articles have been published by members of the team. And I am looking forward to the publication on the big book of Professor Hayes on the topic, which is going to add substantially to our understanding of some aspects of Kabbalah. Maybe at the end I shall have something more to say, but I would like not to delay the lectures. So Professor Jeffrey Hayes, Yossi, who initiated the project he's from Haifa University. He wrote a PhD at Yale University and was interested at the beginning in Safed and woman and the witchcraft and possession and Dibukim. So maybe the Dibuk of the Ilanot entered in him, and he started such a big project, which I hope to see the fruits, final fruits, very soon. Please, Professor Hayes.
Thank you so much, Moshe. Thank you to Barbara, who cajoled me years ago into contributing to the permanent Kabbalah exhibition for the Polin Museum, which uses the magnificent parchment Ilan, copied by the itinerant Polish rabbi David Darshan in the mid-16th century as its virtual gateway, and more recently insisted that Ilanot and this project be given special attention at the conference. Although Eastern European artifacts are very much on our minds, they will be added to our platform in its second phase, and therefore, unfortunately, will not be featured in our presentations this evening. And thanks also to my teacher, the peerless Professor Moshe Idel, who I've known for so many years that he still calls me Jeffrey. I think since my mother died, it's just you who still calls me Jeffrey. But it's a great honor that you've agreed to chair this session. So I'm going to share my screen and hope for the best here. Okay, wait, it's asking me. Can you see it? I can't. Hold on. Allow. You can now. All right, how's this? You're seeing it? Okay, I don't hear anything, but I hope for the best.
It's okay.
Okay, thanks, Eliezer. The God of the I'm going to start out with just a brief setup because I can't assume that everybody knows what Ilanot are. So I apologize if it's a bit remedial for some of you. The God of the Kabbalists exists at considerable remove from the biblical God of Israel. The Greco-Arabic conquest of Jewish thought in the Middle Ages brought with it various theologies, none of which accepted the descriptions of God found in Scripture or in ancient rabbinic sources at face value. Prime mover and the cause of causes, the philosophical God, was beyond description. Kabbalah, which emerged over the course of the 12th and 13th centuries, largely incorporated this philosophically informed theology. God, said the Kabbalists, has two aspects. The first was the God of the philosophers, the utterly unknowable prime mover, which they called Ein Sof, no end, or infinite. The second, 10 hypostatic sfirot, from Keter to Malchut, crown to kingdom. The latter constitute God's fecund interface with creation and could thus be known. Their structure was also susceptible to visualization, whether in the mind's eye or drawn on paper or parchment. Although Kabbalists used a variety of schemata to visualize this invisible realm, over the 14th and 15th centuries, the arboreal schema attained particular prominence. Thus was born the Kabbalistic tree. On Kabbalistic trees, the words Ein Sof often hover atop the spherotic array, as we see here. I read the half-blackened medallion in which they are inscribed as a symbolic signifier, meaning that it is not meant to resemble its referent, but to symbolize its impenetrability to human thought. The second aspect, the 10 sfirot, are of course represented by the tree. The name of each is typically written in bold script within the circles, followed by additional appellations. Longer texts are inscribed in interstitial spaces near the features on the parchment to which they refer. What made the tree so compelling as a visualization of the spherotic array. How might its ascendance be explained? The arboreal schema was a versatile diagrammatic device with diverse, albeit specialized, applications. Akin to today's Venn diagram, it was an information graphic, ideally suited for the visual representation of abstract relations. The arboreal schema had achieved preeminent status in the scientific treatises of the Middle Ages, particularly in works of natural philosophy. It was famously deployed in Porphyry's commentary on Aristotle's categories to visualize the scale of being as a series of dichotomies that branch off of a central column with perfect symmetry. The most abstract and general concept, substance, is at the top, or crown, of the tree. Then follow body, and animate body, animal, and man. The very same device conveniently mapped lineages as well, as we may see in this tree of Jesse, in a mid-14th century French manuscript. As you gaze upon this diagram of Jesus's ancestry, which perhaps for a moment you mistook for a Kabbalistic tree, let it land. Diagrams must never be interpreted on the basis of morphology alone. Why did this schema prove so congenial to the medieval Kabbalists? First, because the appropriation was consistent with their self-perception. Kabbalists understood themselves as men of science engaged in the pursuit of Chokhmat HaNistar, the occult science. It was thus no accident that, as they diagrammed the Sfirot, they availed themselves of trees and concentric circles, the schemata associated with natural philosophy and astronomy, respectively. These were the most prestigious scientific fields of the Middle Ages. Like astronomers, Kabbalists treated and attempted to visualize the invisible. Trees, however, had an undeniable advantage over circles when it came to representing the divine. And this is the second reason I believe the schema was ultimately embraced so extensively. Unlike the circles that signify the crystalline orbs they resembled, the tree was not an iconic signifier. When used to visualize concepts from the scale of being to virtues and vices, it contrasted central and peripheral, primary and derivative, representing relations without actually resembling them. This ability to visualize without any implication of morphological resemblance was an undeniable advantage in a cultural setting within which the iconic representation of the divine was taboo. The Sephirotic array could thus be drawn without any necessary implication of space, and plausibly defended as showing causal relations. In short, the Godhead could be imaged with a schema boasting a prestigious scientific pedigree that bore no corporeal baggage. It is not the arboreal schema to which the research of the Ilanot project is primarily devoted, however, but to the genre that bears its name. Although unfamiliar to many today, Ilanot were among the esoteric corpora enumerated by the 16th century Christian Hebraist Guillaume Postel, and Postel's contemporary, the preeminent Kabbalist Moshe Cordovero, who also evinced a keen sense of their centrality to Kabbalists. In his Summa, Pardes Rimonim, Cordovero treated the graphical visualization of spherotic structure immediately following his discussion of their nature. He opened by noting that the Kabbalists have drawn forms for themselves on parchments and called them Ilan. The name of the genre is thus a synecdoche based on its defining schema. From the 14th to 16th centuries, Ilanot were also referred to as Yeriot, a synecdoche based on their medium. Despite its 700-year history, the genre remained largely unstudied until I established the Ilanot project roughly a decade ago. A session devoted to Ilanot could hardly be a more perfect fit for a conference devoted to innovative methods, new sources, and paradigm shifts, albeit not in that order. Oh, actually, I should have advanced, sorry. I would suggest that, in our case, the order of these foci be reversed, beginning with the relevant paradigm shift, the visual turn in intellectual history, including the history of science that began in the 1980s. This brought with it an attendant interest in diagrams, images that are not art, images with which one is to think. The emerging body of literature devoted to visual Kabbalah, to which a number of scholars are currently contributing, demonstrates the extent to which this paradigm shift has taken hold. The new sources are, of course, Ilanot. Not a single entry on the genre is to be found in Jewish encyclopedias, and until very recently, the number of scholarly publications in which they are referenced could be counted on one hand. Ilanot are not merely new sources, however, but a new kind of source. Their study thus calls for, and indeed demands, innovative methodology, the third focus of this conference. We can neither study nor prepare scientific or critical editions of Ilanot with the familiar existing methods of intellectual and art history. An impressionistic glance at a few Ilanot may suffice to give a sense of why that is the case. As you can see, Ilanot are not merely images. They are also not merely texts. What they are is a distinctive form of iconotext, a term referring to artifacts constituted by an inseparable integration of pictures and texts. For all the aniconism of the arboreal schema, an Ilan still functioned very much like a medieval or early modern map. Unlike the pragmatic maps of our age, designed to get us from point A to point B, these were images that were thought to make present that which they pictured. They were also frequently enriched by texts that introduced or explained the map features to which they were proximate. Ilanot may also be fruitfully compared to the genealogies of kings and the chronicles of history presented in medieval rotuli, widely copied throughout Europe. To research such artifacts, one must be attentive to images, to texts, and above all, to the interplay between the two. In iconotexts, neither images nor texts are autonomous. It can nevertheless be useful and even necessary to unravel them for heuristic purposes. The visual languages and repertoires that find expression in Ilanot certainly warrant investigation in their own right. What images were in the visual repertoire of Kabbalists? How and to what end were visual elements adapted in the course of their integration? What role do the images play in the enactment or performance of an Ilan? What was to be done with them in contemplative practice? The visual language of an Ilan may seem at times determined by individual idiosyncrasies, but is generally expressive of the culture within which its Kabbalistic creator worked and its attendant conceptual and aesthetic preferences. Is the divine pictured with geometrical or representational anthropomorphic imagery? Are the images deployed iconic, indexical, or symbolic? Is the Ilan treated as a ritual object suitable for beautification, to be decorated, even illuminated? As we saw, we need inscriptions to know whether any given arboreal diagram represents Jesus's family or the Sfirot. The same holds true for every visual element, or what we now call map items, in an Ilan. There's more to read than curt captions, however. Indeed, the visual complexity of Ilanot is often matched by extreme textual density. Even at their most pictorial, Kabbalists were verbose. The texts we find on an Ilan were often adapted anthologically and paraphrastically from treatises dear to their makers. Needless to say, they were not presented in the linear manner to which we are all accustomed, and recommended orders of reading are rarely indicated. Ilanot fashioned of multiple stitched sheets of parchment or paper, some reaching a length of over 10 meters, upon which tens of thousands of words have been inscribed in no obvious order, thus present multiple challenges to anyone seeking to study them. This reading is tough. Gershom Scholem who never published a word on the genre, did inspect the Ilanot he chanced upon in some of the great libraries he visited. Of the Bodleian witness of the magnificent parchment, he tellingly wrote in a memo now preserved in the National Library of Israel Archives, that it contained an unbekannte Riesentext, an unknown gigantic text. He did not trouble himself to read, let alone identify it. The 33,000-word anthological array of the bookshelf of a circa 1500 Italian philosophical Kabbalist has only recently been transcribed by our team as part of the first digital critical edition to be featured on the Maps of God portal. As you will hear momentarily from Doctors Safrai and Baumgarten, Scholem also glanced at the great Venetian parchment in the Biblioteca Medicia Laurentiana in Florence. In his haste, Scholem seems to have read only the brief inscriptions of its spherotic medallions, which he then mistakenly presumed to be the source of a medieval commentary on the Sphirot, rather than the reverse. Even for Scholem, studying Ilanot wasn't easy. To recap, the textual norm in an Ilan may be described as a non-linear paraphrastic anthology. What is more, these words must be read in loco, in light of what is imaged by their proximate map item. In the first phase of basic research, the Ilanot project focused on finding Ilanot around the world, often uncatalogued or miscatalogued, establishing their provenance, manuscript families, and the like. We established a database with the media specialists at the University of Haifa Library and collected metadata on hundreds of artifacts, including within our purview Kabbalistic diagrams and codices that we believed relevant to the study of the genre. We also worked diligently to prepare critical editions of Ilanot, which Cherub Press was to publish in a special series. Eventually, however, we came to two realizations. First, a search result in our database indicating that a particular concept was visualized, or a certain text was found somewhere on an Ilan, was clearly suboptimal. The metadata generated by our analysis of Ilanot, in particular, the ideas they visualized, the images they used, and the texts they incorporated, would only be useful were they embedded in, or more precisely, linked to their actual images. Second, to create critical editions of Ilanot in the traditional manner, we would have to deconstruct them, dividing them into page-size fragments and forcing their texts into a linear order of our making. In the process, the opportunity to explore them in all their map-like indeterminacy, to scroll them mimetically, and to keep their texts and images wedded would be lost. Practical considerations of volume size and expense would also conspire to limit the number of images and the range of artifacts that rightly belong in the contextual orbit of a given Ilan. Needless to say, an Ilan facsimile cannot be loaded with linked metadata. The transcription of its texts cannot be searched. Its texts and images cannot be processed by automatic and semi-automatic artificial intelligence technologies to identify parallels, reuse, anomalies, scribes, and so forth, or whatever it is we may think of tomorrow, and then redo in a year's time when the technologies have improved and more linked data is available to leverage. Finally, with all its flaws and limitations, a printed critical edition would be priced beyond the means of ordinary people and reach only a handful of scholars. Our aspiration, however, is to bring this genre with its distinctive nature intact to scholars as well as to a broader interested public. These considerations and objectives inform our work on the Maps of God portal. In 2019, the Volkswagen Foundation funded the Ilanot project, and our partners, the metadata digital humanities experts at the Göttingen State and University Library, to develop a platform tailor-made for the research and presentation of Ilanot. Our digital humanities concept embraces the three facets just reiterated by Marcin Wojcinski in this evening's keynote session: digitizing sources, publishing online, and developing new research tools and questions. As I hope will be clear by the end of the session, our digital online editions might also almost be considered the accidental byproducts produced dynamically as we pursue new questions using new tools. Much of the heavy lifting on the content side of the portal has been accomplished by the extraordinary postdoc researchers with whom I've been privileged to collaborate. Dr. Eliezer Baumgarten, who is also a digital humanities expert, Dr. Uri Safrai, and Dr. Chana Gentili. Having introduced the paradigm shift, new sources, and the need to develop innovative methods to advance the research and presentation of Ilanot, they will now give you a better sense of the methods we are pioneering and those we hope to develop in our next phase, as always, pending adequate funding. Many thanks for your attention and interest.
Okay, thank you very much for mapping the questions which are related to the Ilanot. And now we are moving to Uri Safrai, Dr. Uri Safrai, as a PhD in Kabbalah from
Chana Gentili.
What? You don't hear me?
You're back.
Chana Gentili is now speaking.
Chana Gentili, okay. So Chana Gentili, she has a PhD from a Warburg Institute on Yochanan Alemano and Aristotelianism, something like a year ago. I still have to read it. And she is a young member of the team, as far as I know. And we should listen to someone who is an expert basically in the Renaissance Kabbalistic literature. Please, Chana.
Thank you. So let me share my presentation. Can you see it properly? Eliezer, can you? I don't see. Can you see it properly? Yeah.
Yes, it's okay.
Yes, perfect. So good evening, everyone. I would like to thank the Polin Museum for this invitation, Dr. Michael Trembesh for his technical assistance, Barbara and Professor Riedel for the chairing and the introduction. And I would like to thank Professor Hayes for involving me in this innovative and stimulating project, and the whole Ilanot team for welcoming me from day one. So my background is in cultural intellectual history, medieval and Renaissance philosophy. And this is the first time that I'm part of a digital humanities project. And it has been really interesting for me to see how the team has developed a number of tools to address the unique nature of these materials, these artifacts. As Professor Hayes said, there are a number of theoretical and methodological questions that prompted this digital humanities project. And these are the questions that continue to shape our work as we think about the best way to present these materials to a wide range of readers. I'm the newest member of the team, which includes those of us who are based at the University of Haifa, who are present here today, and the other half of the team based in Göttingen. What I'm going to present today is the result of this collaboration, and the Göttingen team in particular is responsible for the development of the digital platform. What I would like to do today, and it's something different than what I usually do when I speak about medieval and Renaissance philosophy, what I'm going to do today is to give you a sense of what goes on behind the scenes when we analyze and upload the materials in the Maps of God portal. As Professor Hayes explained, the Ilanot are complex iconotexts where image and text must be considered together. These artifacts vary in size, they can be very large and not so easy to handle, and they can be difficult to read. They contain a stratified range of sources and a unique combination of visual and textual elements. The study of these artifacts requires a wide range of philological skills, and above all, it requires a dynamic approach. Each element must be considered in its spatial and conceptual relationship with the surrounding elements, and each source must be considered in its relationship with its philological and cultural context. These materials can be of interest for scholars coming from a variety of disciplines, from cultural and intellectual history to history of art and iconology, for example. The languages we work with at the moment are Hebrew and Aramaic, but these artifacts are also relevant for those who work on other aspects of medieval, Renaissance, and early modern cultural and intellectual history. They can be relevant for scholars and students who are not necessarily proficient in Hebrew paleography, for example. So while working with these artifacts, we have to convey a great deal of information in an efficient and practical way, and we have to adopt a dynamic approach that will facilitate the reader, whether an expert researcher or student. With this in mind, we have provided and we will keep developing a range of research and teaching tools that can maximize the reader's interaction with these artifacts. So let's see a couple of examples that can give you an idea of how these artifacts are mapped and uploaded on the Ilanot portal. The first example is, of course, taken from the Magnificent Parchment. The first set of tools that we use to map an artifact includes an image annotator, VIA, and an XML editing tool. We use a TextGrid Lab, in particular the text image link editor. The combination of these two tools allows us to encode the transcription and translation of the textual content, linking also the metadata to the images. And it gives us the possibility to add comments and references to each element, both visual and textual. The image annotator is the tool that you see here and allows us to draw specific areas on the image and assign an identification number to each area. In this case, for example, we have decided to mark the area 101. And you can see here that we have a number of shapes that we can use as we literally draw on the surface. Once we have marked the area and assigned the name to the item, the fingerprint provides us with a unique ID for that specific area of the artifact. The same ID and zone name are then used when we encode the transcription and translation of the relevant passage. Here we can also add comments, notes, or links to the relevant bibliography related to that specific passage. The result of this process is what you see in the portal, where you click on the specific area of the manuscript and access the transcription of the text, the English translation, commentaries, bibliography, and additional metadata. This is done systematically for each artifact, and you can see that you can also see which areas are marked, and you can see that the whole manuscript is marked up. Interestingly, we can mark up any area of the surface, even areas where there is no text or image if we need to. Let's say, for example, that we want to compare two manuscripts and we want to highlight the similarities and differences between the two. For example, we want to note that in the same area of the surface, one copy presents a text or an image, and another copy presents a blank space, maybe left blank by the copyist, or other hypotheses. So we have many options. We also have the option to do this, and we are free to mark any area of the surface as we wish. These are only a couple of examples of the information that we can add while we map each artifact, and while we study it and compare it with other manuscripts and other Ilanot. On the most basic level, this already facilitates the reading of these artifacts. If we look at the Venetian parchment, the Ilan preserved in the Laurentiana in Florence, we see, for example, that there are areas that are difficult to read. Now, when we use the Ilanot portal, now, for example, this image was already digitized by the Laurentiana Library. So you could zoom in, but that wouldn't facilitate your reading. It would take you skills and time to check if there is anything of your interest in this passage. Now, in the Ilanot portal, you are able to zoom in, select the passage that you're interested in, and access the transcription, the translation, and additional metadata. But you are also able to do, as we saw with in Professor Hayek's presentation, you are also able to do a text-based search. So if you're looking for a specific sentence or a specific word, you can simply search through the text. You don't have to go through the whole Ilan. Now, already in its most basic functions, the portal facilitates the study of the material. You can easily find the passages you're looking for. You can copy and paste the transcription, the translation, bibliographical references. So it makes life easier. But in addition to these basic functionalities, the Ilanot project develops another level of mapping of the artifacts, which truly mirrors the dynamic nature of this material. The mapping and encoding system allows us to mark up any area of the surface, as we said, text or image, full or empty, and encode its relationship with other elements. So not only you're able to find a specific passage that you're looking for, but you will also be able to easily find related passages and metadata. For example, if we have the same text over 2 or more areas, we can encode that one area is the continuation of another. And we can be very specific when we define the correlation of different areas. For example, I can note that 2 elements are spatially contiguous, but not necessarily conceptually related. Or I can note the opposite, that 2 elements are not spatially contiguous, but are in fact conceptually related. In practice, this means that the user in the future will be able to run specific searches. Let's say, for example, that you want to see all the passages related to a specific concept. You want to see where they appear in the manuscript, in the Ilan. You want to see where a specific source is located and next to what is located. And the same goes for visual elements. For example, you want to see where the drawing of the serpent appears and next to what, or what other passages or sources are related to that specific depiction. The range of connections that the user is able to see includes both internal and external references. We can link each text block or image to its source, for example. We can link an area to a specific passage in Sfaria, for example. The entirety of these correlations is included in another fundamental research tool that we are developing, which is a digital ontology. A digital ontology is a classification of a defined set of classes and individuals that are relevant for the domain that we are dealing with. The ontology comprises of classes, for example, Adam Kabnon, Sephira, Ether, and so on. Object properties, so whether this object has sources, whether, as I mentioned before, is continued by another element, whether it is placed on the recto or the verso of the Ilan. We can also note data properties, the size of the area, the icon class notation, the language, and so on. We can also mark individuals, specific authors, specific sources. We can add any class or property. You can see here you have the Sephirot, you have the planets, you have the elements. You also have keywords such as the soul, intellect, ruach. Each of these classes and properties can also be defined. And it is defined on its own, but is also defined in relationship with other elements of the ontology. Each class can have superclasses and subclasses, or can be on the same level of other classes, for example, of other elements. For example, in the case of the class element, we have the subclasses ether, air, earth, fire, and water. Netzach has Sephirah as a superclass, and the other Sephirot are on the same level. The same for Sagittarius, has astrological sign as a superclass, and is on the same level of the other signs, and so on and so forth. The ontology really gives us the opportunity to add an endless number of details and information in a systemized and ordered manner, and allows us to process automatically this data. These are the pieces of information that allow us to define each element in its theoretical and spatial relationship with the other elements and sources. And it is what it truly makes the navigation flexible and dynamic. In the future, hopefully in the near future, the user will be able to make queries using the digital ontology, tailoring the study of the collection based on specific parameters. The ontology is a tool that we are still developing and that has an enormous potential. One of the greatest aspects is, in my opinion, is the fact that the ontology really makes these materials accessible and interdisciplinary. And I'm thinking about two examples based on my personal experience. For example, the dialogue with iconographic databases. I'm thinking about the database of the Warburg Institute. And I'm thinking about the dialogue with the terminology databases that can be scientific and philosophical terminology, can include scientific and philosophical terminology. For example, someone studying the iconology of the serpent, or someone studying the sources concerning the soul and intellect in the Italian Renaissance can find this material and easily access this material and get to know the Ilanot. This can include scholars and students who are not necessarily familiar with the genre of the Ilanot, or with Kabbalah, or with Hebrew. Can be historians of art or iconology who are not familiar with these materials or the languages included here. So the fact that the portal makes the navigation so easy and so clear and provides an English translation of the text and a transcription really helps sharing and opening the use of the access to this collection of Ilanot. This goes both ways. Someone studying Kabbalah or Kabbalistic sources will be able to easily access a number of relevant links concerning the iconography of a specific element or the philosophical implications of a specific term. So it really goes both ways. In other words, the ontology has an enormous potential for both the research and the teaching concerning the Ilanot. Now, this classification is also visual classification. This is also something that we are developing. So you will be able to visualize the relationship between the elements of the ontology. And we have here two basic examples. For example, here, I hope it's big enough to see, you have the class of Sephirah in the middle, and you have all the Sephirot as subclasses of Sephirah. The same happens, for example, when we look at the zodiac signs. You have the class of zodiac sign in the middle and the subclasses all around. So this is another aspect that we are developing, and that can be very interesting, as you can tailor the distance between the elements, and you can tailor how you visualize the ontology. Now, to conclude, our approach addresses some of the technical and theoretical questions concerning these kind of artifacts, meaning, as Professor Hayes said, non-linear iconotexts, where the sources are stratified and the surface is visually complex. These materials challenge us and bring us to reconsider how we think about the critical edition, how we think about the digital edition, but also how we can maximize the user's interaction with the artifacts. The combined use of the XML editor, the image annotator, and the digital ontology provides maximum flexibility and integrates traditional paleographical and philological skills with the advantages of making our data processable by a computer. In addition to facilitating the reading of the Ilanot and text and the identification of their sources, the portal allows text searches and provides links to relevant online and offline resources. The digital ontology provides a visual and geometric representation of the concepts and really helps you to navigate the collection. So I hope I was able to give you an idea of what goes on behind the scene. And I leave the screen to Dr. Uri Safrai and Dr. Eliezer Baumgarten, who will show us the Ilanot portal in action. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. So that's an introduction to the tools of the map. I'm not sure that that's an ontology of God, because there are so many ontologies of different Kabbalists who are disputing and even sharply disputing between them. But it's better to have at least some tools in order to be able to have a small idea, I shall speak later why, about what happened in the minds of the Kabbalists. Their ontology, I must say, they were not so much interested in ontology, but in using the map in order to have a voyage, as we're going to listen now. The map in itself is not so important if you don't use it. And my assumption is that some of the Kabbalists, in my opinion, few, actually used. So we shall listen now to Uri Safrai about the voyage and Eliezer Baumgarten, who are more senior members of the team for several years, to see what is the voyage using the map. Please.
Thank you very much, Professor Idel and Professor Hayes. I was told that my microphone doesn't work so good, so please, if the listeners can increase the volume so that you could hear better. I'm sorry for this technical issue. So I'll start now. Thank you, Professor Idel, Dr. Hannah Gentili, and especially to Professor Hayes to his forthcoming book, The Kabbalistic Tree. Our talk today is deeply in depth. Today, we will survey one of the most unique and interesting Kabbalistic trees that have reached us, the Grand Venetian parchment produced by 16th century Italian Kabbalist Rabbi Menachem Khalfan and Rabbi Avraham Tzarfati. In our talk, we will discuss the complex process of producing a parchment that includes an abundance of visual and textual elements. In so doing, we aim to bring a broader methodological point into focus that pertains to the processes underlying the creation of visual and textual traditions more generally. In particular, we will suggest the significant benefits of using digital humanities tools to expose and examine these processes. Our claim, in short, is that in order to understand the production of the Grand Venetian parchment, but not only this Kabbalistic tree, or even Ilanot more generally, it is insufficient to speak only of the specific sources or libraries used by its producers. Wittgenstein's notion of family resemblance comes closer to the mark. Such artifacts are best understood as particular complex expressions within a fluid family-like network of traditions. Although such is the case with regard to many works of literature, it seems particularly valid with regard to Kabbalistic trees. The differences between the variants found in Ilanot, both in the text and images, tend to be particularly fluid and resist attempts to parse in terms of simple sourcing. The story of the production of the Grand Venetian parchment may be summarized as follows. In 1533, Rabbi Elia Menachem Khalfan extended his gracious hospitality to an older Kabbalist by the name of Rabbi Avraham Tzarfati. Khalfan's comfortable home in Venice provided Tzarfati with a place to recover following the tragic execution of his reversed master, the former converso and messianic activist Shlomo Molcho. Tzarfati was grateful for the succor offered by Khalfan, an affluent physician, rabbinic scholar, and Kabbalist. Deep in conversation, the two hit upon a wonderful idea. They would collaborate in the making of an Ilan. The Ilan created by Khalfan and Tzarfati has reached us largely intact. The imposing squarish Ilan was constructed of 6 oddly shaped parchment sheets, sewn together like a patchwork quilt. As you can see, the Ilan is rich and complex. It includes many visual elements, surrounded by many texts, about 15,000 words. The Ilan seems never to have been copied. Therefore, we have only one unique copy of it. Of the many elements on the parchment, we will select a few key examples to help us demonstrate how digital tools, such as those we are developing on the Maps of God portal of the Ilanot project, can help to reveal and represent family resemblances rather than merely the precise sources used by Khalfan and Tzarfati as they fashioned the Ilan. As you can see, in the Grand Venetian parchment, there are 2 arboreal figures. The upper one represents the highest realm of the Godhead itself. Taken on its own, it resembles other Kabbalistic trees of its era. The lower tree is Akhimdat above it, albeit miniaturized. It represents the angelic realm, which according to medieval Kabbalistic tradition was thought to be located between the highest divine realm and the lower realm of the celestial spheres. A number of the texts inscribed beside the diagrams are devoted to the special Chug HaKruv HaMiyuchad, reflecting an esoteric tradition of northern French origin. By constructing the Ilan so as to represent multiple regions of the cosmos, Khalfan and Tzarfati invested their parchment with rare complexity. What makes the parchment truly unique, however, is its third dimension. Unlike other Ilanot, which suffice with an X and Y, up, down, and right, left, Khalfan and Tzarfati added a Z. On the verse of the parchment, aligned precisely with the lower diminutive tree on the rectum, they inscribed the demonic tree of impurity, Ilan HaTum'ah. The figure is hyperliterally on the Sitra Achra, the other side of the divine realm. In accordance with the verse in Kohelet, God has made one corresponding to the other. Even though the idea of the dual nature of the Kabbalistic Godhead was widespread, indeed it is the subject of the text by the school of Rabbi Yosef Gikatilla adapted to populate the tree of impurity, the Great Venetian parchment is unique in its physical, graphical representation of the concept by means of its exploitation of the verso. Indeed, it is precisely in the attention to the placement of text and images that Khalfan and Tzarfati distinguished the Ilan more generally. As Khalfan and Tzarfati explicitly declare in their respective colophons written on the verso, they constructed the Ilan exclusively from text and images they assiduously collected. Nothing on the parchment was original, i.e. created by either of them. Therefore, the creativity they invested in the parchment is not to be found in novel text or diagrams, but rather in the thoughtful placement and arrangements of the elements chosen for inclusion. That being the case, our analysis will focus on how Khalfan and Tzarfati used the text and images they selected for the parchment. What can we say about their composition rationale? Does something new emerge from the thoughtful array of elements? Is the Great Venetian parchment greater than the sum of its parts? The dominant arboreal figure on the rectum, taken on its own, is a variant of a popular family of medieval Ilanot. As, before its unfortunate disappearance, one of the earliest witnesses to this family was housed in a Jewish Historical Museum in Warsaw. We have dubbed it the Warsaw family. As you can see, the members of this family are quite simple. Each has one central tree above it. Above it, Ein Sof is signified by a medallion, the top half of which is clear and the bottom half of which black. The medallions of the arboreal figure are filled with spherotic appellations. Some of the additional short text inscribed elsewhere on the sheet present idea associated with the circle of the special curve. If we compare the dominant figure on the recto of the Venetian parchment to the trees of the Warsaw family, we can see the many features they share in common. Their close relation is evidenced in the representation of Ein Sof, the inclusion of this same short text, the particular networking of the internal channels, and so on. There are nevertheless important differences. Khalfan and Sarfati did not copy the text found within the medallions of the trees of the Warsaw family. Instead, they filled the medallions of their tree with a text closely related to the commentary on the 10 Sfirot found in a miscellany now in the British Library. Among the components of this beautiful written miscellany, we find what Professor Chayes calls a deconstructed Ilan. As we can see, in the codex, each medallion of the Ilan is preserved on a folio largely devoted to it. Within each circle, the affiliation of the particular sphera are inscribed. Just beneath the circle, each affiliation is explained. Having noticed the correlation between the text found in this deconstructed Ilan and the text found in the medallions of the primary tree of the Great Venetian parchment, Gershom Scholem identified it as Khalfan's commentary on the 10 Sfirot. Our research revealed it to be an earlier commentary closely related to Reuven Tzarfati's commentary on Marechet HaElohut. This 14th century Tzarfati, a Kabbalist of French origins, was also actively involved in the production of Ilanot, as his works on the Great Parchment and the Small Parchment demonstrate. To review, the large central tree of the Great Venetian parchment is closely related to the Ilanot of the Warsaw family, as may be seen in its graphical features, chiefly the representation of Ein Sof and the structure of the channels that network the spherotic hubs. Like the Warsaw family Ilanot, the Great Venetian parchment also features text associated with the special groove. The medallions of the central tree features text related to the commentaries of Reuven Tzarfati. The tree on the verso features text related to a spherotic commentary by the school of Yosef Gikatilia. The Great Venetian parchment is therefore close kin with no few families of text and images. We have not even touched upon its integration of text of Spanish origin or its adornment with illuminations that Fabrizio Lelli has suggested exhibit similarities with Franco-Catalan illuminated Bibles. It is unlikely to be coincidental that Khalfan and Tzarfati, both of whom had French ancestry, relied extensively on French materials in their parchment alongside the Italian and Spanish materials that were well known in Italy at the time. The benefits of a family resemblance approach to analyzing the parchment should now be evident. Rather than looking for a specific source used by Khalfan and Tzarfati, we emphasize family-like kinship networks within which the parchment is embedded. In so doing, we are in a better position to appreciate its broader context, as well as to assess the relative dominance of its various kinship ties. Some family traits are thus particularly prominent and telling, distinguishing the Great Venetian parchment from most compositions of its time and place, namely its French connections. We will close with a brief demonstration of the utility of digital humanities tools to contribute to such research. To begin with, and as said earlier, our data was taken primarily from the Maps of God project portal developed by our colleagues in Göttingen. Although still under development and far from what we ultimately hope to provide for end users, it is already possible to find a complete interactive transcription of the Great Venetian parchment and other parchments at our website. In the portal, our goal is to identify and tag all elements in each manuscript or parchment. By doing so, the connections between similar objects or text may be established and the relations between them examined. As of now, we are doing this manually, but we hope to introduce automatic or semi-automatic functionalities in our next phase of development. Text views technologies also have an important role to play in this research. The text views system developed by the Elia Lab at the University of Haifa will hopefully be incorporated into the Maps of God portal in order to increase the resolution of our analyses of the literary kinship networks of the Ilanot. The mosaic aggregation of text and images found in Ilanot warrant an approach that regards component elements as interrelated rather than isolated. The portal technologies allows us to engage each in a broader context of connections and variants. Finally, we hope that the use of new digital tools will enable us to represent our data in more complex and integrated ways. Printed editions, including ambitious synoptic editions, given the material's constraints, limit the presentation of any given work. The new approach to scientific editions that we at the Ilanot project are pioneering effectively overcomes these limits, allowing users to access a range of materials that is only constrained by our ability to process them for inclusion in the portal. Users can access all variants and see clearly the distinctive features of each and the complex kinship ties and family resemblances that obtain between them. We hope that this short consideration of the Great Venetian Parchment has provided a glimpse into the content of our Ilanot research, as well as into the innovative digital humanities tools we are developing both to undertake and to display it. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you very much. Is Eliezer going to speak or not? No. Okay, so maybe I shall offer some observations. From what I read from the studies published, it's quite obvious the Ilanot become richer and richer and bigger with the development of Kabbalah, Kabbalistic literature, which also becomes parallelly broader and broader. That's part of the visual developing of Kabbalah. And if you can see what happens in Safed, for example, you can see that the parallel in Italy of Khalfan and the Venetian parchment, they are much richer, exactly as the Safedian Kabbalists are writing huge treatises. That is one. Nevertheless, there's a difference. And the difference is that the Italians are very, very eclectic. It's quite obvious in the moment you should have all the tools, we're going to see exactly what are the sources, which are the different sources, which are artificially amassed, brought together. So from this point of view, we shall have, when the tools are going to be available, a better image of the development of Kabbalah in Italy. But at the same time, we're going to see more eclecticism, attempt to show erudition, rather than a unified vision, which is found parallelly in Safed. So I don't assume that the Safedian Kabbalists were very great theologians. That's not my opinion at all. Nevertheless, they are much less eclectic, despite the fact they knew a lot. But they are much less eclectic than the Italians, which means that the idea of a map is much more a map of the literature available rather than a mystical voyage. That's my opinion, how to put it, initial remarks, that we must see actually the rich Italian heritage as part of the Renaissance interest in Kabbalah and Christian Kabbalah, despite the fact they were Jewish and Orthodox Jews. But they are entering this form of displaying erudition and eclecticism rather than having some form of experiential use of the maps. Or to use a term invented by my friend Yuda Libes, which is not derogatory. I'm using it. We're going to see a sablonization of Kabbalah, meaning motifs which are found earlier are repeated in one way or another. And that's not a critique, not an attempt to diminish the importance of the project. But we must be aware that the development of Kabbalah in a certain area, I'm speaking about the Italians, is working more with shablons found earlier rather than innovating new ideas, which is more evident in the Safedian Kabbalah. And again, that's not an attempt to diminish the importance of the project, but to be aware that with the time, people learn more, and Reuven Sarfati is not a Sarfati, he's Italian. And he's bringing together books found in Italy, like Marech Elhut and Abulafia. So that's part of a certain mood that is dominant in Italian Kabbalah. But there is no doubt in the moment we shall have all the tools mentioned by Dr. Gentili, and we shall be able to find the sources. We shall have an image, very important for the history of Kabbalah after 1510, which is much more eclectic than beforehand, much more exotic when you look to the big pictures and all the demons there. And that's something which is found separately in different types of literature. They are brought together in the great schemes of the Kabbalists. So I hope that I shall still be able to enjoy those tools. So please work harder in order to allow me to benefit from such an important project. So thank you very much.
Yossi, we can't hear you.
I can see that you have some questions in the chat, so
Yossi,
cannot hear Yossi again.
Yossi, we can't hear you.
I've asked for some technical support. Trying to fix it. Maybe at that time you could at least answer some questions that appeared in the audience, the other panelists. Because Yossi is muted somehow. Well, somebody else needs. I'm sorry. Somebody else needs to take up because Yossi, I think he logged out. Can you see these questions from the chat? The others?
Yes. Hannah, do you want to answer the question if we can use it on Ktubot?
I was thinking about answering the one on Wikipedia entries. Thank you, Barbara, for all your comments and questions. All very interesting things that you wrote during the presentations. So Eliezer can correct me if I'm wrong. I think at the moment we are trying to do some time management. So we are trying to find a balance between consistency and using things that are already available online and trying to be consistent and precise as much as possible. The idea, I think, was to eventually use only things that we have, of course, checked and edited as necessary. I don't think that at the moment we are using the Wikipedia entries for everything, just in some cases, I think. But the idea is in the future to make sure that what we link is accurate, but also make sure that if there is an available tool online, we fix that and then we link it, so that we make the situation better, both for Wikipedia and for our portal.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, we can hear you.
I just want to say, in something of a response to Professor Edel's remarks, which are perfectly understandable and correct as far as they go, that in a project of this kind, there were various considerations that influenced the choices that we made. First and foremost being the elan that we would begin to work with. The team in Göttingen requested that we begin with the most complex artifact available so that we could develop a system that would have the muscle and the tools to deal with whatever we would subsequently throw at it. And we've been working with them for 3 years. And as we work, we discover what we need the platform to do. So everything is being developed in a kind of provisional, dynamic way. So it's true that we began with a pre-Lurianic artifact in a very challenging one, the magnificent parchment. But I want to take just this opportunity to say that the Ilanot were produced from the 14th century and have been produced until today by Kabbalists in Spain, in Byzantium, in Italy, in Germany, in Yemen, in Kurdistan, in Tzfat, in Damascus, in Egypt, in Poland, so in other words, they're everywhere, and they certainly represent so many different schools of Kabbalistic thought. I felt like it was important to say to my teacher, Professor Edel, that we're not essentializing Kabbalah. And it's true, the ontology was developed on the basis of the first artifact that we ingested. But one of the characteristics of this work is that when we see that it's unsuitable to be applied to the next artifact, so we go back to the Germans and we say, this ontology doesn't work for everything because the Kabbalists who made this Ilan understood the relationship between these categories differently. So we take our content issues back to the platform developers and say that we need to upgrade the platform to deal with the complexity of the content. And we're in pretty good shape with regard to classical or pre-Lurianic Ilanot, but we're now trying to secure funding for phase 2, which will be primarily focused on Lurianic Ilanot from the 17th century going forward. So I wouldn't want anyone to think from the presentations that we're essentializing Kabbalah and creating fixed structures that create some kind of ideal picture of the way everything fits. It's much messier, and we know that it's messier, and we're trying to develop a system that's
smart enough to deal with the mess, to expose the mess, to represent the mess, and to allow scholars to exploit the mess. Now, there are lots of questions I see in the chats. It is very trans-regional. Barbara asks about analyzing ketubot. And I just will say that there's no question that the ways in which we're learning how to mark up iconotexts will be possible to share with other projects. The ontology, of course, is, as you've now heard me say, unique, sometimes unique even to a very small subclass of artifacts. So we wouldn't be able to take, as it currently works, we couldn't now take a ketubah or a pre-modern map, for example, and put it into our system and work with it without making substantial modifications, because everything that we mark up also gets marked up in terms of that ontology, which is what is supposed to reflect how the objects on the page are related to each other. There's also a question about how Ilanot functioned. I think this is another thing that I would say also in response to Professor Edel's remarks. I agree that although there's a tremendous creativity in Ilanot, intellectually speaking, it is probably correct, as he suggests, that they are more likely to be derivative than innovative, intellectual in terms of their intellectual content. That was implicit, I think, also in the fact that all of us this evening stressed that relatively few Ilanot feature texts that were written expressly for Ilanot. They're mostly anthological, paraphrastic and anthological. But I think it's very important, and thank you, Barbara, for making this possible to stress that they shouldn't be considered texts like other Kabbalistic texts. It might be more helpful to think of them as ritual artifacts of one sort or another. If you think about it, scrolls in Jewish culture after the adoption of the Codex in the 9th or 10th century, whenever Malachi Beit Aryeh says it happened, scrolls are used for rituals. Tefillin, Sifrei Torah, Mezuzot, Megillat Esther, yeah? These are ritual artifacts. When Kabbalists chose this medium, they were saying implicitly that Ilanot are for performance. Ilanot are for enactment. And this is a larger conversation, and I would say that the Ilanot project online may not be the most natural way of bringing the performative aspects of Ilanot to life, but it is the case that the scrolling, the mimetic scrolling of an Ilan, especially in the case of the later Lurianic Ilanot, is a mimetic ritual that replays the process of emanation. And on the Ilanot project portal site, on Maps of God, when end users will scroll down an Ilan, they will be closer to the experience of the unfolding of divinity than they would have been had we chopped them into page-sized bits and published them with Cherub Press. Barbara asks more about the performance aspect. We have relatively little literature left by Kabbalists in which we are given directions for use or observations of Kabbalists in their performance of Ilanot. So my answer to your last questions would be speculative. So I can't really speak to the question of reading them aloud, but I think that there are a couple of things to just emphasize. One is that pre-modern images are talismanic in the sense in which Professor Edel has often used the term. The image makes present that which it represents. So any image of the divine is making the divine present before the beholder. So there is a kind of virtual reality dimension to any Ilan. That's the normal magic of an Ilan. It makes that which it represents present to its beholder. And the second one is to reiterate what I said, the experience of unfolding an Ilan is mimetic and connected to the emanatory cosmology that it's representing. And of course, something that is always worthwhile keeping in mind, we shouldn't be reductionist in our appraisal of such a complex artifacts. They were also clearly there. Let's just say you can't say one rule fits all. They were used for study. Some of them were clearly used to show off that you had something beautiful. These magnificent parchments were commissioned, and I'm sure many people who weren't interested in Kabbalah acquired them and kept them in their cabinets of curiosities to show their guests when they had dinner parties. And there were some made by great Kabbalists, and there were some made by people who clearly had no idea what they were copying. And there just is such a range, hundreds of artifacts from communities, Jewish communities around the world. Very difficult to say anything that will be true for all of them. Darshan, you ask about. Darshan, of course, is the special case that's dear to those involved in the Polin Museum exhibitions. Darshan was a Polish Kabbalist, an itinerant figure who reached the city of Modena in Italy in the middle of the 16th century, where he saw an incredible Kabbalistic Ilan and decided to make a copy of it. His copy is not as beautiful and ornately embellished and as artistically executed as the witnesses that we can see today in the Vatican Library, in the Bodleian Library, in the Hebrew Union College Library in Cincinnati. But it's the copy of a very fine scribe who was a serious Kabbalist, who understood what he was copying and had the scribe skills necessary to make a copy of an artifact that he clearly thought was too good to just remember when he was thinking back on his wonderful time in Modena. So he made the copy, and that copy survives today in the British Library. It's somewhat ironic that it forms the gateway to the introduction to Kabbalah, insofar as there was some notion that it would introduce Polish Kabbalah in the museum in Warsaw. But nevertheless, it is trans-regional. A Polish Kabbalist came in the mid-16th century to Modena and brought a souvenir back home called the Magnificent Parchment. Thank you so much.